you find is, one, they have multiple gods, and there's a god that lives in heaven, which is the sky god, and he's at this point in time the one in control. And then there are gods that live underground in hell, or the equivalent, where the place where the dead people go, the souls of the dead go. There are gods that live underneath the water, in a base underneath the water. There are gods that actually live in a home that's identified with the mountains. They maybe did some time on the surface of the planet. But this concept of underground bases and the home of the dead is really interesting. And it's been known as Hades, Tartarus, Zilbaba, Javad, Fatal, and
I carry all four colors.
What's interesting is that when you look at mythology and you look at the beings, the description of the beings that live in these underground realms, especially in the underwater realm, they are always described, or very likely described, as being a half-man, half-fish, half-man, half-reptile, half-man, half some kind of reptilian creature. Now, picture-wise, usually they're represented with kind of like a centaur, with the upper part of the body being a man and then the other part being a fish. However, I think those representations were done long after their interaction with these beings. And is it possible, and I'm just putting it out there, is it possible that what they actually interacted with was someone that had a humanoid-type body shape that was green and scaly? That would be half man, half fish, snake thing too. And depending, because if they came out of the water, because they lived in an underground base, they would be associated with fish. It's interesting because if you look at myths from around the world, that person, that group is always associated with fertility. That group is always associated with the creation of man. That group is always associated with helping humanity and helping mankind. So in Sumerian mythology, well actually
we're going to talk about that when we do our presentation.
in the Bible, everybody knows the story of Noah's Ark. But when you go and look at Sumerian mythology, the sky god, who we always associate with the loving god, the sky god is the one who decided to go and destroy everybody. But it was the fertility god, that half-man, half-fish, half-snake god, that was the one that warned Arcus and Nurple that there was a flood coming. And so we see that narrative happening over and over again through mythology. And so in Sumerian, his name is Enki. If you go to Mesoamerica, we have that snake god, which would be probably. And so there's, again, this very consistent theme going on. When we talk about, so I talked about the half-man, half-fish, and earlier I mentioned about these intergalactic war and all these beings, and they're flying around fighting each other, like a Star Wars thing going on in antiquity. But it's interesting because when you read mythology, we're not just talking about one group, we're not just talking about the sky god people, who I believe we were created in an image, quote unquote, because in contemporary mythology they talk about the Nordics, which had white skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, and I associate them with that group. But we also find in mythology a very strong presence of giants. There were two groups of giants. There were the giant giants. In Greek mythology they called them the Titans. And they were the biggest trees and tallest mountains. And I always like to joke around and say, they were so big that they could pick you up and bite your head off. They were that big. And then there was this other group of giants, which is the ones we more commonly hear about, that were the Nephilim, not the sons of man or God and the daughters of men, but a group of giants that existed when that whole situation happened. And they were like 7 to 12 foot giants.
There we go. It was him. It was the spirit.
It was the ghost.
That's kind of weird.
That's okay. I mean, that was like total comic relief right there. And so that was another group of gods that you hear about in mythology, and you also hear about this group of demon gods, monster gods. They're not demon, they're monsters. You know, and they are described as having like fangs or horns or not really being humanoid looking, although they don't look like octopuses or anything like that. But if you even look at artwork that comes out of India, I mean, some of that stuff is just really bizarre. You know, Indira has like 4 arms or maybe 4 heads, and you know, they talk about these gods that have 100 arms, and so what they actually look like, it's kind of hard to say, but they definitely did not look like us. You know, and these are stories that are believed to be true, and I believe that there is some truth to these stories as well. Okay. You know, so you might ask, where do these guys come from? And it's interesting because when you look at the mythic record, there are 4 major star groups that are talked about in mythology. We only have, or I've only found, 1 direct reference, and that would be from the Dogon, who are in Africa, who talk about their ancestors, their creators, came from Sirius. And actually they came in an ark. There were 8 of them in an ark that came from Sirius and created this world and created humanity, like a long time ago. And that's the only direct reference. But if you look at the stories, they talk very commonly about the Pleiades, Sirius. They talk about the Big Dipper or Draco. I mean, that's what they called it in antiquity. They don't say Draco, but the North Star, but that's where the reference is. And now I'm having a little brain fart here. Oh, duh, and Orion. You know, Orion's belt, how they say the pyramids line up to that. You know, they talk about Venus. I mean, they talk about some other planets, but that seems to be, you know, something will happen and like somebody will die and they will become the 7 sisters, which is the Pleiades. And so there are these references to people going to these star groups, or not necessarily coming from. Okay. So one of the things that I believe, which you will find in this literature, is that there is this whole controversy in the conspiracy theory. You know, if you're, you know, it gets interesting because it's like, how do you even classify this whole concept? You know, because it's conspiracy theory, but it's UFO, but it's not about, you know, are there extraterrestrials? It's even like way over here. I mean, it's even fringy, I think, for the people in the UFO community. But one of the things that they talk about is that there's this intergalactic war going on, and you know, they say that they need to, the Pleiadians say that they need to free humanity from the control of the reptilians and blah, 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 blah. And they're constantly blaming each other, and then the reptilians turn around and say, but we controlled the Earth first, and we want it back. And it was very interesting that there's this whole, you know, and they're like, no you don't, you need to get out of there. But what's interesting is when you look at mythology, that's exactly what you find, is that these fertility gods, these reptilian, half man, half fish, did control the Earth, according to mythology. But what's interesting is some of the stories that come out of there and the relationships that are happening. One of my personal favorites is the story that comes out of India about the churning of the Milky Ocean. And so at that time, the fertility gods were in control. And so a disaster happens and the Earth is flooded. And one of the things they lost in this disaster was their precious Amrita, nectar of immortality. And so they really wanted to get it back. And so the Asuras, okay, so there are 2 groups. There are the Devas, which are the good gods and associated with the heavens. And then there are the Asuras, which are the bad gods. And they're like those snake-like monster creatures. And if you see pictures of the churning of the Milky Ocean, it's interesting because they take this giant snake and they wrap it around a mountain and they churn the ocean. I mean, it almost looks like a drilling operation. And actually, it reads, from, you know, from a contemporary point of view, like they were drilling in the ocean. But what's interesting is that on one side, you have all these like regular human-looking people. You know, they might be blue, but they're human-looking. And then on this side, you have this guy with like this monster head. You know, they're just all kinds of weird-looking things. You know, but it was the divas and the Asuras. And so they churned the ocean for 1,000 years trying to get the Amrita out from underneath the waters, and a number of things happened, but eventually a bunch of stuff started bubbling up from underneath the water, and one of them is the Amrita. Well, the Asuras, bad gods, rush in to go grab the Amrita, but the divas don't want them to have it because it would make them stronger than than them, and so they call out to Vishnu and say, Vishnu, come and save us, help us. And so Vishnu comes down. I mean, these guys are so freaking corrupt. He comes down, he turns himself into a beautiful nymph, and this woman distracts the Asuras, and so they're like looking at her, and the divas rush in and steal the Amrita and drink it all themselves. But the reality was they never planned on sharing it with the Asuras in the first place. You know, they just were getting them to do it because they couldn't do it themselves. Sneaky, sneaky, sneaky. Needless to say, a big war breaks out. You know, and if you look at mythology, this concept of a war between these groups is found in just about every culture. I mean, it's very interesting. Ultimately, and actually I'm just going to throw in because I think it'll make it tie better, even in Greek mythology, I think everyone has heard, and if not, I'll share it, of the war between Zeus and the Titans. Everybody kind of familiar, maybe not with the details, but the Titans, Kronos was in charge of the Titans. Well, Kronos was a fertility god. The Titans were that group of giants that could make you up and bite your head off. And so Zeus was the son of Kronos, but I think that they were actually a different group that wanted to get control. Well, they waged this war against the Titans and Kronos and ultimately win. And so now we have this group of sky gods that are now in charge, and the fertility gods that are associated with down there and underneath the water, they lose, they get sent down to the underworld to live for 1,000 years. Always makes me wonder if that is why when we think